Thank you very much. That concludes our speakers. Our questions from members of council. Councilman Brooks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. Can I get Cole, and then I'm gonna ask Jill a question, and then I'll ask anybody. Do we have anybody from real estate? Wow. Okay. No. The city agency real estate. Everybody like, yeah, I do real estate. No, that's
so. Lisa Lumley was supposed to be here tonight, and she unfortunately came down with an illness and was not able to be here. But Brad Beck from the City Attorney's Office worked on the license agreement with them. If that is helpful for your question.
Great, thanks. We'll start with Cole. And just a quick shout out to Marilyn. Thank you for being here. You're the only high school student here repping. Good job. Cole, real quick, can you just talk about the new elements? And be very descriptive and specific about the new elements of this Good Neighbor Agreement that you've not put in, you didn't have for the Cole agreement.
So thank you for the question. We actually didn't even have a Good Neighbor Agreement with the Cole, Rhino, Curtis Park, 5 Points neighborhood. We didn't get to that point. What we've done over the last several months is actually produce an extremely detailed Good Neighbor Agreement, much more so than many permanent supportive housing projects would have produced for a project like this. What I was trying to point out in a rush earlier was that first and foremost, we've improved our screening and intake process. And so if you do have the Good Neighbor Agreement in front of you, you can see from item 1 is the very first thing. We're talking about how we're going to do screening at the village. One of the very first things we heard from residents of the neighborhood was that mothers saying, we don't want sex offenders coming into our neighborhood. Now, we had a little bit of trouble with that from a philosophical standpoint with Housing First, but we actually took that question to the village residents and we said, so they don't want sex offenders living in the village. What do you think about that? And village residents said, well, we don't want to live with sex offenders either. So that was a very quick and easy thing for us to put into that Good Neighbor Agreement.
Cole, I'm going to stop you right there and go from a legal perspective.
Sure.
Fair housing question with Beck. Beck, can you answer that from a fair housing perspective on sex offenders? There's a microphone for you over there. You don't have to.
Brad Beck from the City Attorney's Office.
Yeah, from a legal perspective, can we do that around sexual offenders? There's certain protections around fair housing. I just want to make sure that
to the extent that they don't conflict with the Fair Housing Act, then it's permissible. But that's how we have framed it with the license agreement.
Okay, and so we feel good about that.
To the extent that they don't conflict.
Okay. And what extent would they conflict?
I'm not prepared to answer that question. I'm happy to investigate it for you and give you an answer.
That would be great if you would. All right, Cole, there are a couple more items. Can you share what those items were that you didn't have a Good Neighbor Agreement before, but what are some of the items that you added?
So one of the things I was trying to say was that this has improved the village. This process has improved the village. The reality is that residents of the Gloveville neighborhood were saying, what are your transition plans like? And so we went back and clarified that in the Good Neighbor Agreement as well. And so that's taken up in item, let's see here. It's taken up in item 8, but we've continued to make a strong commitment to ensuring transition plans. And this is an area that we want stronger partnership as well to help see the outcomes that we desire for village residents, but really clearly clarifying that the intent and purpose of this village is to provide stability and community so that people can restore their lives, have that stability, and then move on in terms of their income and employment into permanent housing. That's the ultimate goal. So that's one. Next item. You want more?
No, that's good. Okay. I think you've covered. Let me ask you one last question. Did you go door to door in this neighborhood?
We went door to door for a month on a weekly basis with Tanya Salih, who's my co-director, who didn't get the opportunity to speak earlier, Michael Sapp from the city's office, and Evangelina Flores, a mom from Garden Place Academy that we hired as a bilingual interpreter. Tanya speaks Spanish, as does Evangelina. We went door to door, and we went primarily to provide information to residents, to say, hey, have you heard about this? What have you been hearing about it? And to explain to them that this is a transformational housing community where people have the opportunity to have safety, stability, and healing.
And how many people said, yeah, I'm in favor, or
So the count that we received was over 100 supportive signatures from the neighbors that we spoke with.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually going to call up Evan Dreyer real quick from the mayor's office. Evan, this has come up several times, and I just want to have a conversation about how do we get here. Obviously, you know, we had a deal worked out, it seems like, in the Rhino neighborhood. Seems like the analysis of that property should have been done much sooner, but we got a late analysis that scrambled, which messed up the process, got us in Globeville. Speak to that.
Councilman Evan Dreyer, Mayor's Office. You're exactly right. The beloved community on its current site had planned to relocate to a site on the taxi property. They submitted their permits. When the review by Public Works came back, Public Works said, we can't approve this because of flood concerns. So that was late last year, and that set off a little bit of a scramble.
Tell me about the time that when they said they wanted to move till it went through the city process to Public Works saying that they couldn't approve it.
I don't know exactly when
Okay.
they submitted their permits, but it was probably early-ish in 2018.
So I think it was April of last year that we in Community Planning and Development started having conversations with Colorado Village Collaborative on some possible sites for the third site. And I believe we notified various agencies of the intention to select the taxi site. I want to say it was July, and permits came in August or September. And then again, the Public Works decision came in October of last year.
So they actually had permits to move.
They had submitted 4 permits. They didn't have them yet. No.
Okay. Okay. And can we just talk about that analysis? Because that is why we're here today. I mean, what happened? Where did we go wrong on the city side and the Public Works side?
Sorry, I'll stay up here. Jill Jennings-Golick, again, Community Planning and Development. So, this was a pilot project, temporary, that we were looking at. And we had done some analysis in terms of allowed land uses, where could this go? It's not mapped as a floodplain. We had some conversations with certain Public Works staff. Unfortunately, it was not the right Public Works staff. So certainly I think moving forward, lesson learned that we will, any future sites, put them through our site development plan process, which goes out to more people and more agencies. But that is unfortunately where the disconnect happened, is that a study had been started in Globeville that identified the flooding concerns at this site, but it wasn't a mapped floodplain, so we were not aware of that fact.
Okay. Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Councilman Brooks. Councilman Lopez.
If you could stay up there, Jill, and then. So just a few questions. And I think Councilman Brooks asked it, but I just wanted to kind of get the timeline straight. When was the site officially a site, a potential site, and were there other sites in the city that were also candidates for tiny homes?
So if you're referencing the Pearl Street site, so that was something, again, the Public Works decision was given in October. We, within the city, again, came to the table to try to find other opportunities and other sites. I believe the Pearl Street site was identified sometime in November, but there were some environmental concerns related to that property and some further analysis and testing that needed to be done before we could determine whether it was a viable option or not. And then at that point, we also brought forward a couple of other city-owned properties along Colfax that the DIDO is currently working on redeveloping to provide affordable housing as well.
What are those sites on Colfax? I mean, you may not want to disclose, but I'm just trying to get an idea of where else in the city, because that's what we've been hearing. Why just this neighborhood?
Sorry, bear with me. I don't have the
no, it's
addresses
okay, Joe.
anymore, but it's 7900 East Colfax.
Okay.
So it's further on East Colfax, and then 83 something East Colfax.
Okay, so that, I wanted to understand that part. Neighborhood, the Good Neighborhood Agreement. When were folks in Globeville approached with that?
So-
First, to discuss?
So we started conversations, some initial one-on-one outreach about the village and the Pearl Street site in January. The Good Neighbor Agreement, I don't think really came up until our first community meeting, which happened on February 7th. And so it's at that point, and Cole could speak further about that, that there was starting to be terms put in place around what a Good Neighbor Agreement might look like.
And I did want to ask Cole a question, if he can. I appreciate that, Jill. Cole, can you answer that question?
Yeah.
So what I want to figure out is, one, is this the only site based on what the needs are?
Right.
Why would it be the only site?
Yeah.
If it is the only site? Two, talk to me about a little bit more about the process with the Good Neighbor Agreement. Who was at the table and who wasn't?
Yeah.
And then what are the things that have been negotiated and what haven't?
Totally. So the city showed us two sites, 4400 Pearl and 7900 East Colfax. The village residents wanted
If
to.
I may interrupt, Cole.
Yeah.
7900 Colfax, where is that?
It's basically like Colfax and Quebec, Syracuse,
Okay.
something like that.
Because-
So nearly Aurora. It's very far away from our current site. And that was really the first and foremost, the largest thing for village residents. Village residents have become at home in the site that they are at 38th and Blake. This site that we're looking at is literally 1/2 mile down the exact same street. It's 1/2 mile down Washington Street. And for them, that feels like it's close to home. Moving all the way across town would be displacing people. There was also the situation of the timeline, and the 7900 East Colfax site already has an RFP out for affordable housing development, so the timeline on that site was very short. This site would give us a longer-term option. At first, that was going to be 4 years. We lowered that to 3 years by listening to the community. In terms of the Good Neighbor Agreement, the first items for the Good Neighbor Agreement came directly from our notes from the first community meeting on February 7th. Steve Nally with Community Planning and Development took notes at that meeting. We went back through those notes and said, okay, what are we hearing from the neighborhood? And let's put those items out as the first items for a Good Neighbor Agreement. It was very rough at that point. We sent it off to Globeville Cares, and Globeville Cares really took leadership, holding down a table at the Panaderia and having conversations with people in the community. The next iteration of that document was a document that just incorporated every single comment that was received on the comments that we had. We went back at the second community meeting, worked with that, brought it back to a third community meeting where we engaged about it. And since then, we've worked individually with RNOs on that. So it's been developed very much in partnership. And seriously, it's been led by neighbors who took that and said they wanted to at least ensure there was going to be a strong dialogue. And so I can't take credit for that at all.
Okay. Let me ask somebody from, thank you, Cole. So let me, gentlemen, do you want to come to the microphone, please? I actually wanted somebody from Globeville that can speak to the organization. I was going to ask Tony, but if you want to, one of you.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll take it.
So same kind of question. So when were you all approached with the Good Neighbor Agreement, and why isn't it signed?
Yeah, so we were first approached with a Good Neighbor Agreement at the first community meeting. However, it was, again, this is the whole imperfect process that was discussed. So it wasn't, so basically, the Good Neighbor Agreement was basically given to us almost as a contract to sign that this is going in. And that's when we pushed back and said, we're not signing this at this moment. We don't want to work on this at this moment. And that sentiment was echoed at all three meetings. To us, it felt like, the neighborhood was being held hostage. That, in this neighborhood agreement, there was concessions that were, hey, this is coming in, so we'll give you this. And that's not something that we were open to at the time.
Is there anything you wanted to add?
No, I was just going to add, and we had a second meeting at Lariton Hall, and that's where they tried to separate the community and discuss a good neighbor agreement and the concession saying, if you guys agree to the good neighbor agreement, then we'll do this for your community. And which at that time, Global Cares was there, Global First was there, and none of them agreed to the good neighbor agreement or the bribe of concessions.
So do you, if I may, Mr. President, just, I'm trying to get at this because Sun Valley is very similar, but the good neighbor agreement came from the community. And we were in this process here, so between the city and the community, discussed, not the city, I'm sorry, but the provider and the community discussed the good neighbor agreement. Now, still with hesitation, but let me ask you something. At what point do you see, if ever, and I say if ever, because I want to give you the benefit of the doubt, what would it take for the good neighbor agreement to be signed if it was to be signed? Is it a complete no, or is the door open? And what are those things that would take you to sign it?
As of right now, no. We're not interested in a good neighbor agreement right now.
Okay.
We have other things that we're trying to take care of in Global, and like we said earlier, we have a whole list of other things that would benefit the community,
Okay.
that would help our community, and that would slow the process of gentrification in our neighborhood.
Okay, thank you.
Paul, if I could just jump in there with that and the hesitation to sign a good neighbor agreement, it's both, the fact that we feel that, that the concessions that were being held over our head, but also we feel that Globeville right now doesn't have the resources to be a good neighbor. In terms of, if, we have, these people who are truly in transition, we don't have the resources for people in transition because the residents that are currently in transition are failing in Globeville. So that's the other hesitation to sign the good neighbor agreement, is that Globeville itself, as lovely as our community is, and as much as we take care of our residents as much as best we can, we feel we don't have the resources to be good neighbors.
We're losing homeowners and renters to neighbors.
Okay. Thank you, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Lopez. Councilwoman Ortega.
Thank you.
Sorry, if one of the council members calls on you, then you can address. Councilman Lopez, that was your line of questioning?
Were you done?
Sure, ma'am.
Okay.
Why don't you come up?
Come on up.
My name is Sister Anna Coop. I'm on the CVC board. And I just want to say to you, Councilman Lopez, that at the second neighborhood meeting where the neighborhood agreement was brought to be discussed, the neighborhood refused. They said, we do not want to discuss this. We only want to vote on whether or not we oppose the village. Okay. So that's my personal experience of the second neighborhood meeting related to the neighborhood agreement.
Thank you, and
I think Councilwoman Ortega was there.
That's right.
As well.
Thank you. Councilwoman Ortega.
Thank you. I have a few questions. So let me first start with, I want to go to the heart of the Good Neighbor Agreement, and I want to ask the city attorney a question. So if we have a Good Neighbor Agreement that is not signed, how, what is the probability that it is actually enforceable?
The Good Neighbor Agreement is between the community and the neighborhood agreements. The city is not a signatory to it.
I understand that.
I'm not sure I understand your question then.
Well, I understand the city has no enforcement role, but there are some things that the city helped insert into the Good Neighbor Agreement, or vice versa. There were some things that were part of the Good Neighbor Agreement that ended up in the lease.
Yes, we took the portions of the Good Neighborhood Agreement that we felt as the landlord of the property we could enforce.
Okay, but I guess, maybe I'm asking you this from a legal perspective, and you're probably not going to opine on this, but if there is no second party to sign an agreement, how do you justify that you have a legitimate agreement?
If you don't have two parties to an agreement, you, by definition, don't have an agreement.
Okay. All right. So let me just move on with my next set of questions. And I wanted to get to, if you could stay there, I have another question for you. This is specific to the lease, and this is on page 2, and you were asked a question about this earlier. It's under section 4, and it's the background checks. So you heard some folks make reference to concern that there are kids that live across the street, and the neighbors wanted to make sure that there were some kind of background checks, assuming this moves forward. What does "to the extent permitted by law" mean?
It means to the extent permitted by law, they can perform these background checks.
Okay, but are they able to perform the background checks? Aren't those typically done by law enforcement?
The actual...
The background checks?
I'm unfamiliar with the exact process.
Don't most organizations contract with law enforcement to do the background checks?
That would be a question for the
Can someone
community.
from
Councilwoman Ortega, I might be able to help out here.
Okay.
Do you want me to try to take a stab at this?
All right.
So to the earlier question asked by Councilman Brooks, the city is very limited in how it can regulate sex offenders. There was a case in the city of Inglewood that was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court saying that the city couldn't essentially zone out sex offenders in its community, but there is not the same limitation on a private party that decides that it's going to run background checks for someone who's going to reside in a private residence. I would assume that to the extent permitted by law, my interpretation of that is there are a lot of privacy protections associated with what sort of information can be, culled on individuals, and so I think that that's just saying, law enforcement may be able to do a deeper dive into certain data, but to check on, sex offender status is not uncommon in private property owners or situations like this, to make sure that there's not dangerous individuals that they're leasing to or allowing in the private residences.
So Cole, can you come forward and just explain what that process would entail in terms of how you all would do the screening? Do you contract with law enforcement to do that? What is that process?
So
Okay.
to our knowledge and what we've looked into thus far, through the Colorado Bureau of Investigation website, we can verify if a potential villager is a registered sex offender or not, and we'll also show whether this person is a sexually violent predator, whether they have failure to register, and if they have any felony charges. And so we've said that we will bar sex offenders from living in the village, that if anyone has felony charges, we will look into that further, and we will devise safety plans around that accordingly. And so that's our expectation for the way we will conduct that process, and we will be doing that screening on everybody that's currently living in the village and anyone that would be coming into the village as well.
And is that CBI record a matter of public information, or is that?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right. So, Cole, since I have you up here, let me ask a question about the previous site that you all looked at in Globeville off of 45th Avenue. What happened there? Why did that site not work out?
So we actually started working after the Women's Village was denied by the Landmark Preservation District in July, which was spoken of earlier. We went on a search for a new site for that village, and a private site was offered to us at 45th and Broadway. And so that was actually how we first engaged with Ms. Flores from Garden Place Academy. We hired her to help us with door-to-door outreach. We did extensive door-to-door outreach at that time to hundreds of homes in the neighborhood, providing information. And we, during that time, knocked on the door of the Globeville Cares president. And we met with Bernadette, and we met with Globeville Cares leadership, and then together we co-convened a community meeting in December. At the community meeting, there were approximately 20 neighbors that turned out, and we had a pretty intense discussion at that meeting about the concept. There was no resolution at the end of that meeting. This was the first time that landowner had met anyone in the neighborhood, and so she came to that meeting and introduced herself, and there were a lot of questions about why she was offering that land to us, and who she was and these kinds of things. At the end of the meeting, John Zapien, a longtime resident of Globeville, stood up and said, "I think we need to take a break on this conversation. Let's slow things down. Let's have more conversation." During the midst of that time, our site at the taxi was falling through, and we were totally scrambling, doing everything we could to keep 12 people in housing. And so we had to say, we're taking a step back from this. We're taking a step back from this project. And at that time, we began to prioritize this site at 4400 Pearl for the beloved community village.
So how did the decision come about that, as opposed to looking at 11 tiny homes, it jumped to 21?
Well,
where did that come up in the process? Was that at the original
So
site
our plans
in Globeville, or was that when it came to this site on Pearl?
So 4500 Broadway was going to be 8 homes for women. It was a copy and paste of the St. Andrews project that we had tried to permit. At 4400 so at Taxi, we had planned to grow the village. So that was already in our conversation. We were planning to grow the village, add more homes, improve upon this model, get more people in housing. That fell through, and we didn't want to give up on that idea. So we prioritized sites that were around this 20,000 square foot size so that we could have around 20 units. That also gives us a better economy of scale in terms of full-time employees from the service provider to help deliver the outcomes that we want to see. So that was how 20 kind of became the number that we were looking for when we were prioritizing sites.
Okay. So let me just follow up with a couple of additional questions. Somebody raised the question about porta potties. Are they anticipated to be on the site or on the street? Somebody raised a question about potentially having them face their house.
Right. So we are proposing to move the existing village as it is with 11 homes and 2 porta potties. We will then be submitting permits to get rid of porta potties altogether, to tap into water and sewer, to have a new community building that will be built by Whiting Turner, our contractor, in addition to these 8 new homes that we want to build. That being said, we will have porta potties for a couple of months. In our initial site plan, we showed those abutting Pearl Street. After dialogue with the neighbors, we quickly moved those to the back. So the current site plan that we've submitted, the porta potties are at the rear of the site, not even visible along the street. They'll be blocked by the houses.
Okay, thank you for addressing that. I have some other questions. We may have other members of council. If you want to put me in the queue to come back.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Ortega. Councilman Cashman.
Thank you, Mr. President. Cole. Thank you, Cole. So the topic was brought up as to your organization's finances.
Yeah.
Would you talk about that as you feel comfortable?
Sure. So we do not have audited financials. We're a brand new nonprofit. That's something that we're working on producing. We don't have a lot of money. I mean, we bootstrapped it to build the tiny home village as it was. So we raised $140,000 from 400 individual donors to build the first village, with support from several foundations that are represented in the room today. And we created some very tiny support to provide Bayod's resources and some small support to provide a half-time salary for me. We have grown the organization a bit over the last couple of years. We currently have about 2.5 FTE on staff for the Colorado Village Collaborative. But I mean, we're not raking it in here. This has been an effort that's mission driven, and we're doing everything we can to gather support to make this successful.
Sure. And I believe I recall from a recent conversation, when you built the original village, you had projected the homes would cost about $7,000 apiece, and they ended up more in the 10 to 15 range.
Correct.
Is that correct?
We'd never built a tiny home village, and we had no idea how much it would actually cost. And it also depends on what was required from the permitting department. So where we ended up with our homes was really about $11,000, $12,000 in material costs. We value them around $15,000 per unit based upon donated labor and things like that.
Okay. Now there was, I believe it was Mr. LaRue, talked about concerns with the maintenance of the buildings in the village.
Yeah.
You know, sound like graffiti and maybe busted windows. Can you talk about, are there requirements?
Right.
Do you have on-site maintenance?
We do have 2 folks that work on maintenance with the village, and then the village, has weekly chores and responsibilities and things like that. There is one house that does have graffiti on it right now, and that's something that we're working on fixing. That wasn't done by a village resident. That was done by somebody coming into the site. And so we're working on that. Another thing that Mr. LaRue addressed was that this house has the word toxic written on it. That is because that person, that woman really enjoys Halloween, and she decorated her house in October for Halloween, and she's, that annoying neighbor that's down the street that still has their Halloween decorations up. The other thing that the house says above the door in wood is the word sanctuary, because that's the way that woman has experienced this house in the time that she's lived there, as a sanctuary space for her. So, not everybody keeps their porch as clean as we would like. That's something that we work on as the provider. That's something that we work with the village to do on a daily basis. But not every porch is as messy as others. It's variety, just like there's a variety in people.
And remind me, is in the agreement, what are the requirements for maintenance and security?
Yeah, so first of all, every village resident is required to sign a tiny home village use agreement, which lays out what the expectations are for them as a resident living in the village. But in terms of the Good Neighbor Agreement, basically it puts the expectation on the Colorado Village Collaborative to maintain the site the way that any site in the city should be maintained. And so what it asks people to do is, if they have problems with weeds, with trash, with noise, things like that, that they contact us, that this document be a way to produce a relationship. And so we've given a 24-hour contact number to the Globeville residents, and we will also post that on a sign outside of the village. So if there's any complaints that need to be addressed concerning trash, weeds, noise, things like that, that they can contact us and we can work on those.
Okay. Thank you. That's all, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman Cashman. Councilwoman Black.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, everyone, for being here so late and for your passion. Cole, I have a few questions for you. With only 3 years here, I'm wondering about your investments in landscaping and water and sewer, and what's going to happen after 3 years.
Sure. So the community building that we're designing is a mobile classroom structure. It can be moved. So everything we put into that, modifying that, we'll be able to take with us, with the exception of the taps for water and sewer. So those will be investments that we will not be able to take with us. And then the landscaping, obviously, that's something that we'll leave behind for the neighborhood. We will work, hopefully, with local landscape architecture firms and landscape companies to donate those kinds of materials that will ultimately be an investment into the community. The place that we'll lose the money is with the water and the sewer taps. That being said, Denver Water has volunteered to at least waive tap fees for us, but we'll still have to pay to run the pipes and that kind of thing. So we're budgeting around $150,000 for the community building and for additional units, and we'll be raising that from individuals throughout Denver.
And have you all considered some kind of more permanent transitional
Sure.
tiny housing that, so you're not put in the position of having to relocate?
Yeah.
And, you know, in 3 years, I'm guessing there will be less land available in
Right.
Denver. So if, you know, could you foresee building that many units on a lot that size that are permanent?
So definitely, we would love to have permanent land. We would love to have permanent zoning. We think this is a both and. We think that a site can be used on a longer term temporary basis to get people into housing quickly that can then move on into permanent housing. And we think that this might be the right kind of thing for a long-term community in some settings as well, as it has been in Austin and other areas.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And then I have one more question for maybe Jill. So one of the neighbors read a long list of the things that people would like to see there, and park came up a lot. And so I'm wondering, in 3 years, would there ever be a path for the city to put a pocket park there?
So I think the city, in partnership with the North Denver Cornerstone Collaborative, the real estate office, really wants to spend the next 3 years engaging in a conversation with the neighborhood. And it's great. They've already got a lot of good ideas in place to discuss the best use for this site and develop a plan for what the property may be used for once the tiny home village leaves. I will note the city does plan, at least now, to retain ownership of the property, given that it does have the wastewater lift station facility that's currently on it as well.
That's good to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Black. Councilman Espinoza.
Jill, you might have to stick around for this. Is Tim Sandos still here? Great. Tim, I'm going to need you, and I think he left, but John Hayden. Is John Hayden still here? Okay. Yeah, sorry. Maybe I'm not speaking into it. So I heard, one question, since everyone was raising their hands for Globeville, can I see that same show of hands of who lives in Globeville? Okay. Can you, of that group, stay up, how many support the tiny home village staying there? I mean, moving to Pearl? And how many oppose? Okay, thank you. Because that was the optic I couldn't quite picture, is how many of your neighborhood residents. So did you see the list that the RNOs talked about, this sort of bigger list of needs, and can you describe what was on it?
Certainly, I might have Tim answer this question. I think at the second public meeting, and then since then, we've received a variety of requests from the neighborhood and neighborhood organizations about things they would like to see happen sooner or be advanced quicker within the neighborhood. And so Tim can respond to that, but I do want to be clear, it's not a in return for the tiny home village, it's a separate conversation as a result of the neighborhood plan and other impacts. So Tim?
The thing that I want you to be cognizant as Tim responds, though, is we have made land use decisions in this community that have drastically affected them in ways that we don't want, I don't think. But so we can change that. And so, meaning that, you know, on their Main Street, 45th, they got the storage building, right? And they used to have a lot of jobs available there. And now we're talking about a Home Depot at their TOD, and now this. So some of this is going to fall back on CPD on what sort of structural things that we can do so that we start getting the outcomes that this community visualized rather than what we're getting. So Tim, go ahead. Thanks.
Good evening. I'm Tim Sandos, Executive Director of the North Denver Cornerstone Collaborative, which is Mayor's initiative for Globeville-Elyria-Swansea. As Jill had mentioned earlier, the second meeting, we asked each of the RNOs to bring a list of recommendations, changes, or things that they wanted to see worked on in the community. Jill pointed out, and I really want to stress, that it was not meant to be lists of things that would be in offset of the tiny homes village. In fact, we really wanted to emphasize that these are things that we wanted to talk to the community about, that they wanted to do, that were in the best interest of the community, whether or not Tiny Homes Village was going to be created or not. And so a number of the things that were listed are already being worked on in the neighborhood plans or in other projects that are happening in Globeville right now. At that time, as you heard Mr. LaRue, I believe it was, say that the neighbors chose not to want to discuss those in opposition of the overall tiny homes project. They didn't want to get into any kind of discussion that would suggest that the neighbors and the people who had voiced opinions over the last couple meetings were in support of the project at all. We have, again, 3 different lists of recommendations that were given by 3 different organizations. One of those organizations talked with us and asked for certain pieces to be put into the Good Neighbor Agreement. Those were included. Those notes that we took from the community with things that they had suggested they wanted in those community meetings were also considered for inclusion. I hope that addresses your question.
Yeah, that does, because as you recall, at the last committee meeting, I had asked you for an update on the action plan that was established with NDCC and the Globeville planning process, and I assume that you're going to be doing that. So I wanted to, one of the things I'm worried about is we talked about many things in 2014 and 2015, and I don't have any real basis on how well that's going, and I think to the degree that we're being successful on that, probably plays into the sort of community's concerns about how much follow through. And, you know, when talking with Evan and Jill about this, that was the thing that I thought was a potential here, right? Which was if we're going to recognize that Globeville's time is actually probably 5 years in the future, because of all the impacts of all the different projects that are going on in there, that this might be a good interim use of this land while you actually make movement on these things. So is that what you're contemplating, and is there any way to speak? I know you can't predict the future about what the administration will look like in a year's time, but you know, if it were the same administration, couldn't you make commitments that we will, you know, couldn't the mayor's office make commitments that this is a budget priority and we're going to move forward on X, Y, and Z things and codify that in a way that this council and that community can fully grapple with?
So a couple things to your questions. One, we have had some really good conversations with the neighborhood organizations about what we might be able to do for future planning. One of those things would be to go back and revisit the neighborhood plans, because the neighborhood in the area has changed, and look to reprioritize what we would focus on in our neighborhood plans and our capital improvement project requests based on the direction that we get from the neighbors and what they're looking for in their neighborhood plans. Secondly, since we started this process, we're about to finish the Globeville drainage study that we've been working on for some time. In that study, there are some recommendations about needs to address drainage all around the Globeville area. And so we'd like to consider looking at that and the recommendations that come from that, and start to explore if we might be able to use that property after Tiny Homes Villages moves for a park that could be a detention holding area for the flooding and drainage that comes off of that area. So those are things that we would like to be discussing with the community and with the neighborhood organizations. And the conversations I've had, and you heard someone testify to that effect, those are the kinds of conversations that the neighborhood would really like to have to look towards the future, and then what kinds of things we can be doing. In addition to that, we have agreed outside the Good Neighbor Agreement to hold quarterly reviews in the community with the entire community, similar to the mayor's community meetings that we have on cabinet in the community. We would ask the neighborhood organizations to identify 3 or 4 topics that they'd want us to address each of these quarterly reviews, and then have the rest of the city agencies, as appropriate, be there with tables to address what they're doing in Globeville specifically, what the last quarter data was, say, for police activity, and what kinds of things they're looking for in the future, and address any questions that people from the community who come participate would have. That can also then help us to understand things that we may not be seeing from the agencies, but the community living there can give us direction on, so that we move to do things that are important to the community.
Awesome, great. One quick one then, Jill, was there any discussion about a waiver process if the other site, the Ringsby site, were used? I mean, because the people, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, hundreds of homes and thousands of maybe lives that are already, endangered of inundation to much deeper levels than the Ringsby site in a 100-year event. So we're talking about a very, very low probability event. Could we actually, which might have some forewarning, so we weren't really putting lives at jeopardy.
We tried. Cole suggested a couple of different alternatives to Public Works to consider. They came up with an emergency evacuation plan and some other ideas, but Public Works really felt that because of the velocity of the water, there really was no safe alternative, and that while raising the site might be a possibility, they estimated it would take probably a year of study in order to come up with a plan that could safely do that.
All right, thanks.
Thank you, Councilman Espinoza. Councilman Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. President. Cole, to the extent that you can without violating any personal privacy, could you tell us why the 2 residents who were evicted? It was said that they were escorted off by police.
So in both cases, those 2 residents were, they made a threat of violence involving a weapon, and the village has a no tolerance policy for violence, weapons, illegal drugs, and so the village determined that a threat of violence involving a weapon was something that should be taken seriously enough that they should not be permitted to leave there. And so that was a really hard discussion that the village led and brought us in as staff and as a supportive community to lead that process. We did also notify the police that was going on, because we wanted to take that threat seriously. And so we had the police there when we were talking with those people.
Okay, it sounds like this was one incident involving 2 people and not 2 separate incidents.
There were 2 separate incidents. Both of them were that threat of that kind.
And they were handled simultaneously?
No, different times.
Oh, I misunderstood then. Okay. Can you tell me, or tell the council and the public, how are the support services going to be provided at the new site on Pearl? Are they the same as what we've heard described at 38th and Blake?
Yeah.
Bayard is involved?
Correct.
Just briefly, maybe in 30 seconds, describe that.
So Bayard brings the laundry truck to the village once a week as a point of contact with village residents, and then village residents have the opportunity to opt into that resource navigation, like Scott described.
Okay, are there any other supportive services?
So we have staff, we have village organizers that work with the village to facilitate village meetings, to work on accountability, to ensure that that village residents are following the community agreements.
Okay, are there any caseworkers who come in and offer any sort of counseling or job training or education, or in other words, how do the folks get into school or get jobs?
Residents can opt into that through Bayard, but that is something that we would like to expand as well.
That comes right. Okay, Jill, I had too bad there's not a seat up here for you to permanently occupy. Is it fair to say that this was a flawed process as far as public outreach?
Yes.
Because I understand the emergent nature of it when we had a site and what. And I just want the community to understand the emergent nature of this, and I don't know what could have been done differently. Maybe you could do an after effect
Well,
study
I
on.
think, as I mentioned,
Learned.
moving forward, we'll be moving sites through the site development plan process, which has 30-plus agencies looking at sites to make sure that any fatal flaws like this are known as early as possible.
And then finally, I want to understand the legal basis and legal authority under zoning to make this move. And this is a UMX3 zone, and temporary structures are not allowed there, or I don't think anywhere. Actually, they're not addressed in the zoning code. They're in the building and fire code.
So zoning does have allowance for temporary uses and temporary structures.
Right. I didn't see this type in the UMX3, though. So explain the authority for doing this.
Certainly. So the zoning administrator has the authority in the Denver zoning code to make unlisted use determinations, be that temporary uses.
That's why I don't see it in
yes,
there.
or primary uses. And so the way we have done this to date is through an unlisted temporary use determination.
Okay.
We have been working collaboratively through the group living process that is happening, a conversation right now with members of the community via task force and members of city council to update our group living regulations in our zoning code, which are pretty out of date. And so the tiny home village is a component of that.
Okay.
And so we will be putting together actual regulations, both temporary and eventually permanent, to address this.
And now, temporary structures generally have been, the way I've understood them, in any zone district would be something like a construction trailer during construction. That's why we have them permitted for 6 months. And we extended this to 360 days for temporary structures that are being used for residential purpose. And so after 360 days, this is a 3-year license. So do we have to do an exception again each year to continue the license?
So
Will that come to us, or does that?
So we are proposing building code changes as well to the zoning code. The 360-day period really lives in the building code, not the zoning code today. And so we have worked with Cole and others to develop some language to really codify how we've been working with the tiny home village from a code perspective. And we'll be moving forward changes to our 2016 Denver Building and Fire Code, as well as the 18, which is currently in drafting process, that will codify what we're calling longer term temporary. And that's really based on a model from Denver Water that they use. They have a 2-year water license that they will extend for one additional 2-year term. And so that's the model which we are going with for longer term temporary, which is how this site will be addressed and permitted.
And is this a temporary use? Will this go away after 3 years?
Yes.
Okay, and we will retain ownership of the water and sewer utilities that are installed?
In terms of the pipes, I don't know that the lease, I'm looking to Brad
I
back,
didn't. That's
calls
why
out whether they get
see it
removed
in
or
the.
not.
I didn't see it in the license agreement. So when Cole talked about it, I was going to raise that because I know we've been told in committee that they will be required to hook up to water and sewer.
Yes.
But of course, you can't take that with you.
Right.
So when it's gone, we will have water and sewer to the site. Correct.
That is correct.
We'll own
Those
that.
permanent improvements would become a permanent fixture to the property and would remain with the property.
Okay. I believe that is all the questions I have, Mr. President.
Thank you,
very
Councilman
much.
Flynn. Councilman New, you're next up. I'm sorry, if you're called upon to answer a question, the chance for comments was before this. This is a chance for council members to call on who they select. Councilman New, you're next up.
Cole, let me ask a question, please. We've been talking about a 3 or 4 year, agreement, a license, I guess a license, right? And what is the intention of that time period? I mean, is this a temporary situation? And because I got the impression from what Tim was saying is that really this is a more permanent situation and not something that would be used for some other benefit for the community. How's this going to work? Is this truly temporary? Are you going to be looking for a more permanent location like Councilwoman Black said?
Our intention is to use this site for 3 years and then to look for a new site, whether that's temporary or permanent. We don't know yet. We don't know the answer to that question at this point. But we do think that this is a good interim land use that can be replicated on other sites throughout the city. So my answer is that we will be there for 3 years, and then we will be looking for a new site, either temporary or permanent.
Okay. Tim, can I ask you a question since you addressed that? So if Cole's correct, and this is just temporary location, and like Jill saying, it's all temporary approvals, and so the permanent location is found, then it will move, and then this site will be used for something else for the benefit of the community. Is that correct?
Yes, Councilman, and that's part of what we would like to engage the community in discussions of over the next couple of years. There are any kind of plan, as you know, generally takes a little while to get set up. Let's say specifically if park use was going to be there, it takes a couple of years for the design, for the recommendations from parks, and then funding for what it would take to do that. We think that we could be using this 3 years to try to efficiently identify what can be there so that we've got something ready when Tiny Homes Village moves.
Say we approve this 3-year deal, and what assurance does the community have that you'll be leaving in 3 years and they're going to have some of the benefit restored to that site? Can the city give some kind of agreement to that? Can it be put in the license, or can it, the Good Neighbor Agreement doesn't have any legal authority, and so it's not going to matter to the residents, but what assurance can the city give that it's going to be a win-win situation? We're going to have temporary housing for the tiny homes, and we'll look for a more permanent location, and in 3 years, the community is going to get this land back for their benefit.
Okay. So right now, Councilman, I don't know that we've got a mechanism to make any kind of guarantees going forward. We have said that the NDCC would take responsibility for working with the communities and continuing with the work that we do now in the neighborhoods, both to look at the existing neighborhood plans and then see how this would fit in there. As we start to move down the road with Parks and Rec, with the drainage study, and recommendations that come from that, we may have some better options than I can give tonight. But tonight, I don't know of any mechanism that we could use to give a guarantee unless Jill knows something. She's stepping up.
Well, I think just to clarify, the license agreement is for 1 year term with 2 renewals. So it's a 3-year license agreement, which you are voting on tonight.
Right. Well, I'm just worried about what's going to happen after 3 years. And the main thing is, I think if Tim, if you could give your guarantee to the residents, or the mayor's office could give some guarantee to these residents that this is really a temporary situation and you're going to get some improvement back to this, I think maybe the residents would be more comfortable with that kind of.
Yeah.
Okay, excuse me. If you're not called on, this is the part that the council member can call on. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to watch in 432. That's part of our process. I know it can be frustrating. It is the councilman's prerogative who he's asking the question to. Please don't shout things out.
So what we had done in addition to the Good Neighbors Agreement is shared with the neighborhood our commitment to work with them over the next 3 years on this and virtually every other project that we've got through the neighborhood plans. The neighborhood plans do have within them goals and hopes, opportunities that we want to drive for. We are committing to working with the neighborhood to refine those and then to be able to work from the recommendations that they give us.
I hope you'd be able to do something more concrete than that. Strategies are good. I'd like to see actions in a letter would be nice. Anyway, thank you.
Happy to put that together.
Okay. Thank you, Councilman New. Councilwoman Gilmore.
Last question. You'd like to come up and give your comment about this situation?
So that land was blacktopped without anybody knowing about it. It's got some contamination issues, and we're having it tested. That was blacktopped without anybody knowing it, and it will never be able to be turned into a park because it was a former Superfund site.
Okay.
Yes, we're having it tested.
Okay.
So
Okay. Thank you very much.
Councilman New, anything further?
Jill, let me just ask Jill about this. Jill, what's the story on this site?
Hi, I'm actually going to have Zach Clayton from Department of Public Health and Environment come up to talk about it.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, council members. Zach Clayton, Manager of Environmental Land Use and Planning for Department of Public Health and Environment for the City and County of Denver. We did a comprehensive soil investigation and groundwater investigation consisting of 15 soil borings and 3 groundwaters at the site. There was minimal contamination found in 3 of the borings. So in order to alleviate or eliminate any exposure to that, we had Public Works bring in the recycled asphalt, which is a pre-approved beneficial reuse by the Colorado Department of Health and Environment.
And why was that asphalt put in?
Sorry?
Over here. Why was that asphalt done?
The recycled asphalt?
Yeah.
It's just to eliminate any exposure to any contamination within the soil.
Can that land be converted to a park later?
Yes, sir.
Just safely with no problems?
Yes, sir. It's just recycled. It can easily come up, to be quite honest.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Councilman New. Councilwoman Gilmore.
Thank you, President Clark. Ann Elizabeth, can I have you come up to the microphone, please? I wondered if you might share with us a little bit about your perception of the process that's transpired from the beginning until where we're at right now.
I appreciate the opportunity to do that. There are a couple gaps and spins that I think are very important to address. I would like to say that from the very beginning, when Globeville Cares brought folks to the table, the statement coming from the neighborhood was and is that regardless that Globeville Cares, or starting with Globeville Cares and expanding out, is that a stress was being put on Globeville to enter into the conversation for the possibility of bringing in the tiny homes. And regardless of what happened with the tiny homes, the advancing of the improvements of the neighborhood should be on the agenda with the city. And it appeared that the city was receptive to that, and there were prepared documents that got very specific, department by department, one regarding projects and those sorts of things. I think it should be made very clear we don't need to change the neighborhood plan. We don't need to have a 3-year conversation. There are things as simple as exporting a map of all the sidewalks that have already been provided for, so we can see what's on the timeline and see what else needs to be done. Can we consider immediately talking about things that can be dealt with that are clearly part of the neighborhood plan that certainly don't take 3 years? We had a situation here where there were 2 sites considered for tiny homes, the 4500 Broadway site, which Cole did mention and gave the impression that there was a certain type of outreach, but I'm going to stop myself from saying too much here because of time, but I really would ask the council to understand there's a lot more going on here than we're able to represent. I highly recommended to the city that they not divide into groups at one of the meetings, the Laridan Hall meetings, of the Laridan Hall group, and we were divided into groups from the outset to discuss asked to discuss a good neighborhood agreement and a list of benefits. And there were clearly people that justifiably felt any conversation about anything having to do with the GNA or benefits was an acquiescence to something that was had not been made clear in terms of how it was going to impact the neighborhood. And on that moment, Globeville took up the difficult mantle of saying this has to be vetted, and it is not a judgment of the individuals coming in. So there are very specific things that can be dealt with and moved forward now. I trust the report that land can be reclaimed because that was just given, and I reported this to the neighborhood too. I talked to the project manager from Public Works during the somewhat embarrassing cleanup that was done, and he was very clear. It could be the asphalt could be brought up and it could be reclaimed. And then one thing about this GNA conversation. Early on in the conversations, I want the council to know, there was some conversation about what was, and somebody's going to have to bring this forward from the city or something, about what would be called an advisory group. The GNA that has been drafted, and I was the receptacle of a lot of, just because I type well, essentially, of a lot of these things that ended up in annotations that came from the minds of the neighbors in these discussions having to do with GNAs and possibly accelerating the benefits to the neighborhood that was taking on the stress by land use being taken out of the larger vitalization of the aspirations of the neighborhood. There was conversation about an advisory committee that was very indigenous to the neighborhood if this happened. That has disappeared, and the GNA that was drafted has what appears to be a list of RNOs from Kingdom Come. And my assertion is this is a one-year agreement, a revocable license with possibly 2 years renewal at the discretion of the city. And if there is not, if this passes, and if there is not a very strong relationship between the folks in proximity from Pearl Street to Lincoln, between East 44th Avenue and East 45th and possibly East 46th Avenue, in conversation directly with the city on this as their guardian, as landowners, and with the enforcement on the operator, then that can't be. That is a license that can't be renewed because the relationship is not formed. And I just want to ask that this be recognized, that the city has an obligation. There are specifics that have been named in particulars with GNA types of things. There have been some put into the lease, that is, or the license that's being proposed. But let's not spin the process. We don't need to create inertia through overburdened conversations about these lists of things. Some of them are long-term, some of them could be dealt with immediately. They could be sequenced. So in sharing the stress of creating whatever's going on here and whether or not it ends up in Globeville, this has, as Cole mentioned, the project has been improved. The tiny home project has already gained insight, gained structure, gained wisdom for other neighborhoods, relationships, gained momentum, and it has largely been because this neighborhood challenged for their own well-being the standards and practices of how the neighborhood was entered and what was going on here. So I hope that helps ground it a little bit more in understanding that we can get specific about a lot of things, and it doesn't have to be held up in a 3-year conversation or modification of a neighborhood plan. There's a lot of things that are easily accessible, and there's some that are long-term.
Perfect. Thank you. I have a final question for Cole. I'm assuming, Cole, that you were at that meeting at Lairdon Hall. Was that meeting at Lairdon Hall led by the city in partnership with you, or solely as the city?
So it was hosted by, the city and Colorado Village Collaborative. Evan Dreyer and Tanya Saleh kicked off the meeting, invited us to split up into 2 groups, one to discuss the Good Neighbor Agreement, a second to discuss community benefits. The majority of people stayed in the middle and said, we don't want to have a discussion. Some people did come and sit down at the table with me and discuss the Good Neighbor Agreement. A handful of neighbors did so.
Within the Good Neighbor Agreement, is the advisory group, or would you be open to having an advisory group?
Yes, I'd like to call your attention to item 14 in the Good Neighbor Agreement, which says CVC will hold monthly advisory council meetings for as long as necessary upon the opening of the village. The advisory council meetings will include Globeville neighbors, village resident staff, and then lists the group, every RNO that has jurisdiction, and community-based organizations that have jurisdiction in this neighborhood that will be invited to attend those advisory council meetings.
And even though, the second party to the Good Neighbor Agreement, maybe they're not interested in signing at this point in time, but you as a partner in that Good Neighbor Agreement, you're ready to implement and uphold all of the parts?
We believe that this document makes the village better and it improves the neighborhood if the village is to be there. And so we intend to live up to this document, and we also have every intent to continue working with neighbors to try to reach an agreement in the days ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Gilmore. Councilwoman Kenichi.
Thank you. I just wanted to put a pin in a question that Councilman New had asked regarding whether the city could promise that there wouldn't just be an extension of this site forever. And so, Kirsten Crawford, can you just clarify for us this lease, 1 year with 2 renewals, is there any legal way that the city could continue this site without coming back to this council beyond the 3 years?
No. So it's within your purview, so you would have to approve the extension.
So there would be no way for them to just extend it. There would be a vote of this council through all the public processes if there was any discussion about this project not leaving this site.
That's right.
Okay, thank you. That's all, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilwoman Kinich. Councilwoman Ortega.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just have a few left, and some of them have been covered. Jill, would you mind coming back to the microphone? And those of you in the front, as we keep calling them up, there's a bunch of seats open. If you wouldn't mind maybe vacating a couple of seats so that as we keep relying on our city folks, it might be helpful to just have them sit in the front row, if you don't mind. Thank you. Jill, one of the things that your agency has committed to doing is whenever we have any development that is adjacent to railroad tracks, a developer is asked to check the box, and then they're asked to look at how they would address buffering. This site should be no different, and this has not been part of the discussion at all. So I want to know how has that been addressed, and if so, how? Because as we all know, the site is adjacent to a storage yard, and I can remember a time when this very yard actually had both Globeville as well as Lower Highlands evacuated because of an acid spill. And we have tanker cars that often sit on these tracks that carry flammable liquids and other hazardous materials. So help me understand if that was addressed with the tiny homes, and I'll let them speak as well, so where we're at with that issue.
Yes, so that is something we did look at. There is a 25-foot buffer between essentially the edge of the tracks and then the start of where the tiny home village property would be. And that's, again, to provide a buffer between the railroad tracks and the village, as well as provide access for Public Works to access their wastewater facility that's closer to the Washington Street side. So we did consider that, and that's why we put that buffer sort of roadway in place.
So did you look at the recommendations that were in the work product that came out of the 6-month process that was spearheaded by Chief Tade that spelled out buffering recommendations? Because it's my recollection that it's far in excess of that if you're not doing some kind of berming, or in cases where somebody's building a garage structure, the garage could be the buffer adjacent to the tracks?
So again, outside of having sort of the general conversation and understanding the concerns about the proximity to the railroad track, no, that was as far as the conversation went. But again, we felt like because this was a temporary use of the property, we had done at least enough to help mitigate some of the possible concerns.
Okay, so let's talk about drainage for a minute. Clearly, we know that both of these sites are in the inundation area. Both the site on the taxi property, which city has allowed new construction and permanent structures to be built on that in that area, knowing that it is still an inundation area. But this site also receives flooding, not just from the South Platte River, but also from the Utah Junction outfall. So how is it that we think one site is more safe than the other, knowing that both of them receive flooding issues from, stormwater during flooding?
So we reviewed both sites. The Pearl Pearl Street site in particular with the city's floodplain staff. And yes, you're right. While it is also in an inundation area, it does not have the velocity of water that the taxi site has. And that was really the concern. Public Works has required that the finished floor elevation of the structures be, I think, 1.5 feet above elevation, which they will be, and they'll be meeting that requirement, so they shouldn't have floodwaters inundating the residences. But that, for my understanding, and unfortunately there's no one from Public Works here, but it was really the velocity of the water at the taxi site that was the utmost concern. That is not as big a concern at this site.
Well, this side of Washington is, we've been told there were other people that wanted to develop in this area on the east side, the west side of Washington, and have been told they had to build a 4-foot-high foundation. The storage units that Councilman Espinoza talked about were required to build that because of the flooding issues. And so I guess I'm a little concerned about the safety of the residents who would be expected to be living in a flooded area. And so I just want to share that. The last thing I'll mention is that I pleaded with our Public Works Department when we were doing the Platte to Park Hill drainage project that dumps all the water into Globeville Landing outfall, which is just right at the edge of, well, it's within the center of the Globeville neighborhood. And there was nothing done to address the flooding in the Globeville neighborhood, which is an unfortunate situation when you consider the fact that we spent $300 million for that drainage project. One last question, and it is about so I guess when we look at the process, and Evan, are you still here? There you are in the back. Oh, I would like you to come forward, Evan. It's my recollection that before the very first meeting was held in the Globeville neighborhood, this lease was actually moved forward to the City Council committee that moved it forward, I guess not having realized that there had not even been a first community meeting. I guess I'm trying to understand what the logic in that was, given the fact that we had a misstep in the Sun Valley neighborhood around not extending that same kind of courtesy to a low-income community, and thought we would have learned from that process, but yet we encountered the same thing in this neighborhood. So help me understand why we can't get this right, because this should not be happening. We should not be treating our low-income communities any different than we would be treating any other neighborhood in this city. And this is part of the crux of what has us at this crossroads right now, because had we taken the step back, not moved the lease forward, I think we'd have a whole different conversation here tonight. But that has created this situation where people who feel like they were totally disregarded have dug their heels in the sand to say, wait a minute, we're tired of not being considered. And when you consider the fact that this particular corner, this property is a very property the neighborhood had been asking to have cleaned up and whatnot, and yet, couldn't get a response from the city, but yet, we turned around and paved the site. And the community saw the improvements go in, and that was a clear indication that it. So let me just let you answer the question.
Sure. I mean, I wish I could tell you that any of what you just said was wrong, but it's not. And while we have apologized to the village and the village residents and to the neighborhood, I think we also owe all of you an apology as well for putting you in a difficult position where you're going to have to choose and make a decision. The specific reason why we brought the proposed license agreement to council before there had actually been neighborhood engagement or a neighborhood meeting is Again, we were victimized by timing. We had a deadline that the village's landlord had placed on the village at that time. We had a permit with the city that was about to expire, and we felt like there was urgency and we needed to act. So we scheduled the committee meeting. We had also scheduled the neighborhood meeting to happen just 2 days later. I think all of this combined is just it's another example of the immense imperfection of the process.
But we did take 6 months at the previous site, right?
We did get some additional time.
When it originally went into the site that it's at, wasn't that a 6-month process?
It was a longer process.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, let me just see if I have one last question here. I think I've covered all of them. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Councilwoman
Mr.
Ortega.
President.
Seeing no other questions, the public hearing for Council Resolutions 367 is closed. Comments by members of council. Councilman Brooks, this one is in your district. You want to go first?
I'll go. First of all, my goodness, it's 10 p.m. and you all are still here, so thank you for coming through security and sitting on those hard seats. And each of you really given an impassioned debate and conversation about this issue. So I'm coming to you tonight as a city councilman, but also a father and a husband in this district, and who's been on the front lines of all of these conversations on all of these issues. And it's not an easy one at all. This is a tough conversation. But I want to just start by saying and acknowledging the folks from Glowville who are here and who I've heard at all the meetings. It's been about 80 years of not just not acknowledging you, racist oppression in this city. Our community in our city turning our backs on you. And that's real. And that's where a lot of your frustration comes from, a lot of your anger comes from. And to people out in the community who've been upset at Glowville about this process, I think to understand that history, I think is really important. So I want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge since about 2012, 13, 14, 15, there's been a radical shift where equity in my mind means that you right the wrongs by making an extreme investment in that community, more of an investment than you do to the rest of the city. So what I'm about to say is you might see some shaking heads along here because these folks on this council have been like, man, Glowville again, Glowville again, Glowville again. And I'm going to read it. I'm just going to read it because I've been writing it down, and I've been hearing that we haven't been making that investment. So I just want to be quite honest. Several council members have told me that, and around the city, that we don't have small area plans. In this city, in this area, we do. And we're actually activating those small area plans faster than any other part of the city. And that's because there's a lot going on. A lot of folks talk about investment in the parks. Every park in this community has been invested in at the tune of $10 million since I've been on city council. Argo, Heron, Platt Farm, Carpio Sanguinetti, I mean, all of them, right? Someone talked about Stapleton Rec Center, an investment of over $30,000 just to make sure it has new equipment and things like that. Someone talks about executing on the Glowville plan to make sure that the oversaturation of marijuana facilities are stopped. This council right here actually brought legislation to start limiting the use of more marijuana facilities. Some of us want to do a little more. It didn't pass, but that happened. And my staff, myself, stayed to midnight closing down one particular marijuana facility. The Denver bond, this community is going to see over $30 million in the Denver bond. And that Denver bond is this. It's connecting all those sidewalks that AE was talking about in this community at the tune of $17 million. because it's a disconnected community. It should be connected. Washington Street was something that has been identified as something important in this community, and to take trucks the different direction. So let's make sure that it's a pedestrian-heavy, bike-heavy, activated place so that grocery stores will come. All of those things are happening. And then lastly, I got about 10 more things, but I'm gonna stop because other people want to talk. Lastly, the National Western Center is seen as not a community project, but this actual community in these precincts voted for the National Western Center higher than anyone else in the city. And a fund, a citizens community investment fund that Councilwoman Ortega is working on, along with myself, along with the National Western Center, is being set up just for the neighbors. So when we say that there hasn't been an investment, that's just not accurate. What's accurate is you've been overlooked. I've been at every meeting. I led a meeting, and, you know, this pains me because our process was completely broken. The process wasn't right, and you heard that. I went so far as to say, okay, Cole, team, let's figure out where to put this in the Cole community. Because the Cole community was the first community that said, this process went well. And those leaders wanted to go around the city and say that this process went so well that we need to implement it other places. So we looked at this property that we took from Douglas Bruce and said, let's put it here. Unfortunately, the time did not go right for us to do it, and it was late. I'm just going to say this and leave it at this. The process is wrong, but people's lives are important. And we can't build walls in our community. We can't at all. It's not acceptable. And we need to lead in this area of the city and have an example to say, yes, Globeville first, and the rest of the community too. And so the entire city of Denver, this is not just Globeville. I'm gonna take the words out of John Hayden's mouth tonight. The entire city of Denver has to be accepting of the continuum of housing plan for all, or we are in trouble. We're in trouble as a city. Yes, Cherry Creek. So I'm voting yes, because this is about our whole city, and this is about our future in Denver. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Brooks. Councilwoman Kinich.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I want to thank my colleague for his very moving comments. I wanted to pick up on a thread that Councilman Brooks mentioned, which is about the history of racial oppression in this neighborhood. And I think that actually, I want to be more specific, that part of the reason that Globeville was a community of mostly individuals of color and working class folks was because of a history of land use that said, we go to certain communities and we ask them who they want to live near. And if they don't want to live near someone else, we'll put them somewhere else. And so the history of that with single family zoning, right, is that we're going to build big lots and only people who can afford a house this big can live there, right? Well, first we actually did it explicitly by race. And we said you can't live here because of your race. But then that got ruled unconstitutional. So then we came up with other ways to create it. And so we said, if you can't build your house this big, you can't live here. And you can't have multifamily housing, which is what most people rent. So you can't have that here. And so, in fact, we created areas of our city where disempowered communities were concentrated. And so there was unsafe air or near industrial areas like Globeville. And so what we have learned is that we can't ask folks permission for who gets to live next door, right? I'm out, I'm gay. And in the past, folks used to say, you can't live next door to us if you're gay because two unrelated people can't live together. And then there was an HIV crisis in the 80s, and we used to say, you can't have someone with AIDS because I'm afraid my kids might catch it, and you can't live next door to me. And each era, whether it's about race, whether it was about sexual orientation or HIV status, you name it, we have this really challenging part of process. What is the process? And so the process cannot be, do you white neighbors want to have folks who might be of different races next to you? I can't ask that question. I can't give one neighbor permission to keep out another neighbor. And that, where we are now in that evolution, is we're at that conversation about income. And I will share with you how it looks sometimes, and we'll see what the vote is like on this council tonight. But sometimes that has been wealthy neighbors wanting to talk about why, wealthy single-family homeowners talking about why they don't want market rate apartments. I'm not talking about even affordable apartments, but we had a very prominent project in a neighborhood that was on the agenda earlier tonight on Monaco Boulevard, where there was a question about whether it was appropriate to have apartments of any kind because renters, you know, were inferior. They brought crime. Some of the same comments that were made tonight about crime and these other issues. And so lower property values, all of that. And so the challenge the city faces, I think, is what does good process look like if what you're not doing is going to a community and saying, do you give permission for someone else who's different than you to live there? And that is really tough. What does authentic process look like if what I'm not asking is permission? And so I don't think we have a great answer to that. We made clear mistakes here in this case, no question, and we've made them in many processes. But I think what I want you to know is that your concerns and your tensions are not without ears hearing them. And so for me personally, what my last few years on this council watching these conversations happen has led me to is that we need a process that has leaders in neighborhoods coming together with people who provide services, together with the people who fund them and make the rules, to say, here's what authentic process looks like. It's not permission, but it is, how do you want this relationship to look? How is it that you want to be engaged? How is it that you want to learn about the residents of this site? And how can we have the conversation differently than how it happened? Because I do believe we can do better and we can do different. But it may not ever get to the point where some folks get to say, you can't live next door to me because your income's different. That's not a place I think we can go. Just like in the history, when we went there, it was wrong. So we can do better, and I'm convening that process. So in May, we're beginning with a stakeholder group to come up with a model for how we talk about supportive housing for those who are exiting homelessness and how we have an authentic conversation. And John Zappian is one of the participants. And, so we have members of more affluent communities and members of communities that are more diverse so that we can talk about how to do it better. And so you can teach us and we can teach each other. So that's one thing. I don't want this to happen again, and this is an action item to prevent that. The second thing is, how is it that you have more choices for where these different pieces go? I will tell you, one of the things that's interesting being an at-large council person is I can count on all my fingers and all my toes the neighborhoods I've been in the last year who've told me they're the only ones getting these services. So I get to move all around. So I hear Globeville tonight saying, why us? Why always dumping on us? And again, that word dumping has been hard for me to listen to tonight, I got to tell you. To use that word around human beings and their housing has been tough. And so I'm just going to acknowledge that it's been hard to be empathetic with that word being used. But I've been in Capitol Hill telling me they get all the services. I've been in Curtis Park telling me they have all the services. Southwest Denver has recently been telling me they have too many services. I go to all, and so there are services going in almost every corner of this city, because each of those neighborhoods tells me there's too many of them in their area. So one of the things that I get the privilege of doing in this at-large seat is seeing that bird's eye view. Does that mean that there's enough opportunity for services everywhere? Nope, because guess what? That history of zoning is still there. So where we have areas that are exclusively single family, we're not going to be creating the same opportunity for racial diversity as where there is multifamily zoning. So there is work to be done. In this case, with tiny home villages, Part of the reason there weren't a dozen more sites for the city to look at was because the zoning is so ad hoc. You heard a little discussion about the fact that it has to be a decision with an administrative appeal of an unlisted use, right? That's all gobbledygook for saying the zoning code doesn't allow this. So I want to credit the city staff and the community who've been working in this group living process to create a path, but it was going to take a really long time for that. So I want folks to know that I will be bringing forward a public process in June with the department doing the hard lifting for there to be more sites zoned, more zoning districts where this use is allowed, so that there are a more diversity of neighborhoods. And it's not just a small group of industrial areas or a small group of multifamily areas, that there has to be some broader range, so that instead of us saying to you, we're sorry, but there were only 2 sites in the whole city, we could go, because that was true. It was true because we have a land use barrier. So we're going to fix that land use barrier, I hope, with the support of this council, and we'll have a public process, and everyone will get to engage with the proposals that have been through some vetting. So those are 2 concrete steps to try to change that history of inequity. The history of inequity of land use decisions being based on permission, and the history of inequity in terms of where certain uses can go. It's happening after this debate, and I understand that. But what we can't do is answer the historic inequity with exclusion. Adding exclusion to people based on income in this neighborhood doesn't correct the history of inequity. And I will continue to advocate, just as I have been an advocate for the platform open space in Globeville, for the investments that are needed. And it took us way too long. It took us 8 years. We're going to break ground this year, but that park is in one of the quadrants. There are many Globevilles, right? There's 4 Globevilles. I will continue to champion those investments. But exclusion is not the answer to inequity. And so for those reasons, I will be supporting this tonight while I work to make sure that the system is not so flawed the next time around. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Kenichi. Councilman New.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think you've heard several times tonight this process was flawed. There's no question about it was flawed. You weren't given the respect that you deserve when this kind of decision is being made. And we hate these kind of decisions on council as well. We expect that process to go smoothly because we want it to go smoothly. We want to make sure neighborhoods have a voice in what decisions are made about their neighborhoods. And we also believe in what's going to happen with the tiny homes, too. We're just desperate for affordable housing, especially for the folks. So I feel badly for what happened to you, and I look back at just the lack of planning and communication about this whole process. And maybe it should have occurred when they first moved to their second site, not even before you even considered. Maybe we should have been planning then. Where's that permanent going to be home a couple of years ago for tiny homes, In hindsight, it's great to say these things, but I think we need to be thinking much further ahead in the future so we can avoid these kind of situations like we're having tonight. So, I'm going to be making my decision on understanding that there will probably be no license extension. I'm hoping there'll be no license extension on these property, and that this property is going to come back to Globeville. And the city is going to make an investment to make sure it's an asset for your community. So that's my understanding, and that's how I'll be making my decision tonight. And also, Cole, I'll be expecting to see progress reports on what's going on with the planning for a permanent home, as well as what's going to happen with this site as well. So we'll expect to see some progress reports in the future about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman New. Councilman Lopez.
Thank you, Madam President. So I'm going to start just by saying a few things. One, I appreciate folks being in the chambers and staying all the way to 10:20. It'll probably be a little bit longer. So, this neighborhood is very near and dear to my heart. A lot of folks think, he's the West Sider. Been in District 3 and representing District 3 for 12 years. It's West Side. I know this neighborhood very, very well, and I cut my teeth in this neighborhood. My mother was a teacher over at Swansea. younger years as a community organizer was under the mentorship of Lorraine Granado. I'm very familiar with the area. Before the idea of even doing anything to I-70, we were knocking on doors and knocked on every single door in this whole corridor and got to know a lot of priorities and needs. And this was years ago, almost 20 years ago. And one of those has been a grocery store. One of those has been a park. It's been so many different things. And so I understand when people say, hey, look, this is a vacant piece of land, and as a neighborhood, we want to see something happen with these parts of land. But the truth is aside from a park, the city is not a developer, even though it owns the land. Doesn't mean it can just plop a grocery store down. I've tried that in my neighborhood. For 12 years, we tried to get a big grocery store in the neighborhood. City's not the factor. There are other factors that are beyond our control. We've created 2 new parks out of vacant land. So it is possible. And it takes that leadership and that organization. So I'm going to say this, and I'm sorry that Brooks left, because I wanted to address this as well, too. You always have to have an open door. You always have to have an open door to communication, to negotiations. I am not happy with the way neighbors have been pit against each other. I don't like the scenario. Just like my colleague, Councilman Ortega, we're here just, I'm here rubbing my forehead because it's frustrating. But it's not enough to say that this is flawed. We deserve better leadership. And you deserve a better approach at this. I hate when people come to council and say, and I get it, say, hey, why'd you do this? Y'all are messing this up. This is not an initiative of the councils. It's brought in front of us for a vote to consider. Sun Valley is an excellent example. Even though we knew that similar services, folks who don't have homes, were going to be occupying a building that had been sat and vacant, homeless individuals with services, living in the neighborhood. There was pushback, same arguments, but we made sure that there was a neighborhood agreement. And folks in the neighborhood made sure that they were able to negotiate those terms. But the door has to remain open. And I have to say this because these are other Globeville residents. These are other people who are no longer homeless. They have a home, albeit it's tiny. But I know some homes in Westwood that are tiny. I know folks who are living in converted garages in our neighborhood waiting for ADU designation so they can continue to live in the neighborhood that previously they could be homeless. I don't know. It's none of my business. All I know is they're my neighbors. I don't ask them where they get their income. I don't ask them how they get it. I just treat them with the same kind of respect. And I'm not casting blame on anybody or anything else, but that's what we really have to take a look at. Now, I'm of the school of thought that I get it. Tiny homes were a solution because having people just outside isn't. Folks need a place so they can go home, iron their uniform for their job, and be able to go to work, to shower, to shave, to cook a meal, at least, to get ready for the next day, or else you cannot expect anybody to lift themselves up from some kind of proverbial bootstrap. And yes, it is our responsibility in the public. It is a function of government to look after each other. Right? It is. And we have, and so what I wanted to say with that is that it's not necessarily, I'm not slamming tiny homes when I say this because it is a viable solution. But The best thing to happen is a home. What's better than a tiny home? A regular home. If there was affordable housing being built at this site, would there be the same kind of pushback because these are folks who are formlessly homeless? I know in our neck of the woods, we've done everything possible to make sure that we create affordable housing where we have the opportunity to. As a matter of fact, that's going to come before us again. I have to say this, and I'm sorry to go on, but I got to really, really stress to community the importance of making sure when you're organizing to leave that door open, or else you're not going to get anything out of it. You have to leave that door open. It's not a zero-sum game. The other thing is, I don't believe in burnt, scorched the earth politics. I don't. That's not negotiation. That's not community organizing. And I want to put this out there because I got called out. When you organize, and there's something you care passionately about, you give it your best foot forward. My staff have been in my office for 9 years. They are probably the most courteous, not to take away from anybody else's staff, but they're professional. They're really good people. They deal with a lot of phone calls on my behalf, a lot of mean stuff, a lot of just people coming in. They deserve the same kind of professional respect. They deserve the same kind of courtesy. They deserve to be treated with that respect and courtesy. Because when they're not, they ain't got no business in my office. I'm sorry. If you cannot come into the office and treat regular people who are just doing their job with respect, you ain't got no business with me. And I would do the same thing for anybody else. I come from the restaurant industry. I know when somebody's discourteous to me. After serving them food, after taking and washing their plates, you can really judge a person by the way they treat people who have nothing to offer them. I want to make sure, and I wanted to say that with all love and respect. That's why. And I asked, I'd love to meet with somebody else who can come in here and carry this flag and this cause and the importance of this voice in our neighborhood, that can do it in a way that's respectful. It's courteous, and we did. So I understand the issues. I just want to make sure that I wanted to put that out there. I'm not going to be a city councilman, right? But for me, that's critical. I'm going to end by just saying this. I'm sorry I went off on a tangent, Mr. President. I really feel like I just had to put that out there. The alternative is vacant land. Vacant land in a city that people are being priced out of. Vacant land in which some of your neighbors are being priced out of, even some of in our poorest neighborhoods are being priced out of. Vacant land in which somebody can call home. Let's call it home. Let's make sure it's not just in the poor areas of the city. Let's make sure that it's in truly every corner of the city. And let's make sure that tiny homes aren't just the new standard, that they are regular homes. It is I won't be on council. I hope to see this from another point of view, even if it's just as a citizen. But there is nothing to stop the city from making these tiny homes bigger and operating them as such. Nobody should be sleeping outside, being criminalized to do so, and then not an opportunity to live in a regular home. I'm not talking about single family, I'm just saying a regular home that is dignified, and that's what we owe folks, right? So I understand, with all love and respect, I absolutely understand. But I'm telling you as your brother, and as somebody who knows the neighborhood, somebody who's born and raised here, somebody who's been homeless, whose family had to move from places all over the place, there's nothing like, even if it's a 2-bedroom for 6 people, there's nothing like being able to come home to a shower and ironing my poor, messed up dickies to go to school the next day. It sure beats anything else. So with that, I'm going to be supportive of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Lopez. We've got Councilman Espinosa up next.
A lot of people know that before I was on council, I was an architect, and I think I've said it before from the dais that that's one of the things, or definitely said it in the community, but I think I've said it from the dais before, that one of the biggest sort of struggles that I had is that when you're in the architecture profession, everyone is hired by the property owner or the project owner, and even though there might be some animus amongst the some disagreement amongst the team between the owner, the architect, and the contractor, and subcontractors, and everyone involved, and consultants, you're still trying to complete the same thing. And the other thing, though, that is different than this job is that everyone's employed. Everyone's like either a professional or in a trade, I mean, either a professional in a design profession or a consulting profession. They're wealthy because they own a project, or they're a contractor. And at the scale that I did projects, they were pretty well-off contractors. In this role, you deal with people at all levels. And there's this thing called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it deals with personalities and people who are, at the base and are like looking for food. They're operating different than somebody who's got all of those things taken care of. So when you come to me as a community at the lowest levels of Maslow's pyramid, I don't expect you to treat me respectfully. I recognize that because you heard it here tonight, you have been disregarded. Tim Reenan in the back, AE in the back. No, when these things came before council, I said be prepared because this is a conversation we're going to have in the future. You can't put a temporary permit. You can't extend it without thinking about what you just set up. The real problem here is DHA, not even in this room, right? They're the ones that cleared their housing site 10 years ago, and this group found an opportunity to make a case. And then DHA kicked you off. That land is still vacant where you were today. It just sold for $15 million. Remember, DHA sold it for $7 million. Sold on February 6th to a New York REIT, or New York Trust, real estate company, apartment developer. 256 units are being planned for that site. Market rate. Somewhere in there was the capacity to house people for the better part of 10 years in a format like this. Somewhere in there was the ability to collateralize that land value into something on site. There was an affordable housing component, the Curtis Park Group. I believe that site remains vacant. That was supposed to be the owner-occupied affordable housing, but at 80 to 115% AMI. Again, you could be there right now. That's the question I was going to ask John Hayden if he was still here. He was from Curtis Park. He says this needs to be in everybody's neighborhood. Well, could we put 12 units of tiny homes on that site if there's no plan going forward right now that's manifest or funded? So why it's really a problem for me and DHA is we just gave them $100+ million of bonded money to do what they do, and that includes this. You know, there should be, I'm not going to be on this dais, but there should be a priority on this council that DHA, our nonprofit partners, anybody who's sitting on vacant land, ULC's in there among them. Sorry, guys. Every one of your properties that is sitting there fallow, unused, should be subject to required licensure for tiny home use. But to Councilwoman Kenesha's point, though, we should have a better process. But it should meet you where you're at and not expect you to come in like people on Leedsdale. You know, they can go and have that fight at the highest levels because they hire the best attorneys. They hire the best consultants. Good luck with that, Globeville. They party with the best people. I've seen it. I was Jefferson Park. I moved there 20 years ago. It was Globeville. It is not Globeville anymore. We tried to keep ourselves in there at the same time as allowing newcomers in. Guess what? Developers, wealthy developers, they don't ask. They just do. They acquire, they move forward, they come to the city and make everyone fend for themselves. And so what started all this is I want to acknowledge the stress that you two gentlemen and Jerry Burton particularly clearly communicated, which is I believe it. It happened in my neighborhood where we're operating at a high level. DHA wanted to do a project that was completely incompatible with the neighborhood. Neighborhood put up a fight for 2 years. You know, but what they did when they came in is said, look, we're going to build this affordable housing. Housing is a crisis in this city. We're going to end around you and your community because this council won't turn down an affordable housing project that DHA puts forward because our priority and what we're doing is too important to listen to you. So I don't know if this crisis was legitimate because of the whole bunch of things that went wrong, or if this was manufactured. That's conjecture. I'm telling you right now, I don't know. But man, if you wanted to force something down a community's throat, put it in crisis, right? And we will respond because we care. So the good news is we did care, you guys cared, everyone cared, and you got to this point where all of a sudden it was the licensure was a 1 year plus 2, you know, plus 1 plus 1. Got some concessions, but yeah, needed more time to get it right. The thing that frustrates me is we keep talking tonight about it should be everywhere. I don't know if this is going to turn around, but I had already mentioned my concern when we approved this landmarking tonight. That's the Shangri-La property. That is City of County of Denver. Why not put a bunch of tiny homes on that nice grassy park on Shangri-La? You could put the entire village right now, right there, and put it in a community that's not Globeville. So, and I'm telling you right now, there's an Excel site in my district, 38th and Irving, that is decommissioned, demolished. Sometime in the next 2 years, that probably will come up for sale, and the city will have first right of refusal. Bring it to Northwest Denver. A cottage village, make you guys part of the neighborhood. Unfortunately, I won't be there, but I think all my predecessors, all the people vying for my seat would probably feel the same way. You know, so you guys, I already mentioned it in my questioning, you guys have been getting shafted. And so it's the difference between what you want and what you're getting, right? You've been promised a lot, but you've been enduring way more than what you've been promised. And what you've been promised isn't actually the things that you're desiring or needing. And so, been talking about that thing for 4 years. These are things we can see some of us can see eyes wide open. And I think people in the community see it better than anybody. And, but we keep going the way we feel we're handcuffed to, not the way, even though we know we could do better. I think you're seeing, this effort, this occupation of that site, the subsequent removal, and the village in its iterations, along with a whole bunch of other things in the city, have finally moved the conscience of this city to a place where we will be more accepting. We will have to figure this one out. I'm rambling now. I've done it a lot, and I'm doing it again. The thing that I'm just getting at is $1.5 million for Together Denver, right? To oppose your effort to fight the camping ban, which we could have done something about, but the votes were never there. But this project was $140,000, so you could have done 10 of them for the amount of money donated to fight that effort. Why don't we come together on a solution if we're telling everybody that it should be everywhere? I think if we allowed 2 tiny homes on every block, you could do this in 16 blocks, what we're doing here. Now, we don't have the central services and things like that, and so there's real benefit to what is being proposed here. So what you're hearing from me is a very, very torn attitude, because I want to be there 100% with Globeville residents who are in opposition, because I understand where that's coming from, and I think it's real, it's genuine, and it's valid. We did create this crisis. We are in crisis mode, and we need a solution. And I do think that this solution is actually good in the regards that I was talking about before, which is I think what we've done as a city to Globeville is made you guys the future of Denver, not the now of Denver. And recognizing that, owning that, and just saying, okay, we're going to make Globeville as complete and as healthy as we can right now. We're going to work with them to sort of actually come up with a plan, and I think Tim's always been capable of this and has proven it. Come up with a plan on how we're going to get there in 5 years, and get commitment from the mayor's office that we're going to fund those efforts on a strategic way, so that and we're going to do it in a way that we're going to address displacement and gentrification, so that we have mechanisms so that you don't lose the equity that you've put into your home, and that you've endured, throughout this time, and that the windfall that will eventually come because of all the other investments in that area land on your lap. Because I have seen too many households in Jefferson Park not have their properties. They've had their properties sold out from underneath them. The opportunity comes after they leave, and somebody who's totally not interested in the city but only interested in turning a profit pulls money out of the community. So we can do better, we can do different, and the conversations are happening. It's too slow for me, but it's happening, and you're making that happen. So that said, if I vote for this, know that it's because there's an end in sight. We have Tim in the Northeast and the North, working on this, and I have a separate commitment. And I'd love it if you nod your head in affirmative, Evan Dreyer in the corner. But we have commitment from the mayor's office that we're going to follow through on the things, these action plans, once they've been fully articulated and worked out with the community. Thank you, Evan. And so that was the only thing. And so all we have now is their word, which is less than an agreement, and it's a lot what you've had already. But I am somewhat empowered by having the bully pulpit, and I'm using it right now. And hopefully after I'm out of office, if you guys aren't getting that follow through, you will hear about it from me. And I will go into your community and work with you to help make sure that those outcomes are achieved. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Espinoza. Councilman Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. President. Following this issue when it first came up, after the other site fell through, I had the feeling all along that we were being presented with the real Hobson's choice, which is really no choice at all. Hobson's choice is take it or leave it. And I know that that's how the Globeville community feels. But in a broader sense, it's worse than a Hobson's choice because it's not take it or leave it. If we were to vote no on this license, then the status quo does not remain. It changes. It changes for a dozen people. Voting no on this doesn't leave it the way it is. Voting no on this means that the tiny home village at 38th and Blake goes away, and 12 people who are working on putting their lives back together, and some of whom already have and have been replaced by new tenants, go back on the street. So voting no is not something I can do on this. And so I'll be supporting it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman Flynn. Councilman Cashman.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you all for coming down. And as Councilman Brooks always reminds us, sitting on those hard chairs, hard pews for so long. I want to thank the longtime residents of Globeville. I want to thank you for loving your neighborhood and loving the city much more than the city loved you back for a long time. Again, my colleague Councilman Brooks pointed out, Denver has awakened to the injustice and has begun trying to right some historic wrongs. If I was in your chair, I think you all are handling this issue and yourselves extremely well. And I appreciate that a great deal. You know, I spent a lot of time in Globeville when I first came to Denver a lot of years ago. Friends Larry and Dean Moore lived up on 45th. And when I went back through the neighborhood recently to look at the property in question and drove down 45th, y'all had some great bones, some wonderful older architecture that I hope the city makes use of and really turns this into something special, not just another invisible community. As far as the public process, you know, imperfect is such a lousy word for it. You know, it's terrible. It's just terrible. And it happens over and over that, you know, we all get so involved in the projects that we're trying to create that going out into the community doesn't happen at the first blush the way it should. And that needs to be changed. And along with Councilwoman Kanicha's efforts, Councilwoman Sussman and I are looking at formulating a stakeholder group to see what we can do in general in better supporting our neighborhood groups across the city and how we can do a better job of that two-pronged responsibility of having those neighborhood groups telling the neighbors what the city is doing and having those neighbors come back and tell us what they think about what we're doing. We're also, as far as just looking at the tiny homes, a group of us will, looks like, be going down to Austin in June to look at their Community First project there, 51 acres that's looking at getting 500 people off the street. Now, will we be able to replicate 51 acres? Maybe. I don't know where that plot of land is right now, but it's something that Reverend Henderson said earlier, that it's much more difficult to build community than to build buildings, and it's something that we really need to do. I so appreciated some of my colleagues' words about the demonizing of not just the homeless, but of anyone in lower economic groups or race, color, creed, national origin, sexual orientation that still goes on, and we need to do better at that. And I just want one thing that the whole discussion really frustrates me with is we're talking about 20 units. We all know the numbers that we need, not just for the homeless, but for our workforce, so on and so forth. And we need, as a city, to get way more focused and with more focused intent on where we're going to come up with the land to build this, because we need to find the land and we need to build. So I'm 110% behind beloved community village. I'm 110% behind the Globeville neighbors. The beginnings of what we're talking about with equity need to continue, and it can't just be a quid pro quo. Well, if we build this village here, we'll give you $50 or whatever. This needs to be a long-term reparations. And again, I appreciate you all very, very much. Appreciate what you've done for decades, and very much appreciate your handling of the situation. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman Cashman. Councilwoman Ortega.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just sort of piggybacking what Councilman Cashman was talking about, this city has decided to follow the work that Seattle is doing around race and equity, and we have well in excess of 100 employees in our city who have been trained. But it can't be lip service. It has to be genuine, and it has to be done on the front end. We cannot keep, treating low-income neighborhoods, including our tiny home village folks, in a different way than what we treat other neighborhoods. We have voted down requests that have come in before this body from affluent neighborhoods where neighbors didn't want a project in their neighborhood. But in this case, we're talking about a community that has, I have a list here. So we've got Lairdon Hall in Globeville. We have Salvation Army, which is the facility on Broadway. It's not open right now, but we're not sure what they're going to do with the site. There is homeless housing in the Polish Catholic Church. That was done with Denver's Road Home. Mile High Behavioral Health is in the neighborhood on the other side of I-25. And then we have the Crossroads Shelter that is also one of the largest shelters in the city that houses upwards to 500 people a night. That's part of the Globeville neighborhood as well. So to say Globeville's not doing their part, I would argue that question. I've served on the group living ordinance with Cole, who I have a great amount of respect for, and I actually said from this dais, we should have tiny home villages across the city that are permanent locations. We have not yet completed the work of the group living ordinance, but if we have the flexibility for our zoning administrator to be able to flex the rules to allow a 3-year agreement on this site, we should have been able to do that at the church location or any church locations where we know there are there's a large amount of land, and there are at least a couple addresses that I provided to Cole to take a look at that are in Southwest Denver that could be ideal for other locations in the city to be able to have tiny homes in their neighborhoods. I'm not sure where we're at in that process, but in this case, our administration has to learn that respect and process matters in all of our neighborhoods. It can't be we pick and choose where we apply the rules, right? They're either consistent or they're not. And I'm frustrated. I mean, because I have the greatest amount of respect for the work that has taken place with ensuring that we have housing for people who are living in our tiny homes right now, and really making a difference for the lives of these individuals. But at the same time, you know, we ignored process with a neighborhood that has struggled with trying to get the attention and priorities that they want. Solving the damn flooding problem should have been a priority for this city. But guess what? We spent $300 million on addressing flooding that does not a damn thing for Globeville, right? That in itself, and I said this to our public works manager at the time, this is a crime. How do we justify that? So you're hearing some of my frustration just having tried to, you know, be in the middle and work on behalf of these neighborhoods that are dealing with the monstrosity of a new highway project coming through their neighborhood, where half the damn time you can't get in and out of the neighborhood. I've tried to go to meetings where I've had to literally go all the way around to Suncor just to get to the neighborhood. So I know the struggles these neighborhoods are dealing with. And I say these because, you know, Globeville, Leary, and Swansea are struggling with some of the same challenges. So I guess where we can flex the rules in one place to say we can make it work here, we should have been able to do that at the church site. And the fact that we didn't frustrates me, and I'm hoping that with the changes that will be coming forward with the group living ordinance, it not only gives us more changes and more flexibility for our tiny homes, but with many of our other group living categories that will hopefully free up opportunities for people who are struggling across this city to find something they can afford to live in. And I'm committed to the work that the group has been doing, along with my colleague, Councilwoman Kanich, who's been serving on that process as well. I am concerned about the safety of the individuals who will be living on this site because of the proximity to the railroad and the fact that we have hazardous materials that daily, multiple times throughout the day, are on that track right next to the site. The drainage issue is one that we know that this side of Washington experiences flooding. And it may not be at the same velocity as the taxi site, but I don't know what that will look like if we have a really bad rainstorm. So are we intentionally putting people in harm's way? I don't know, but I am concerned about the safety of people who will be on that site. I appreciate the work that's being done around the other safety issues that we talked about. I think that will provide some greater safeguards, if you will, not only for the residents of Globeville, but for the rest of the people who will be living on the site. I really want to support this. I'm frustrated with the process. I want to support the Globeville neighborhood in all of what they have struggled to achieve and to try to make sure that there is this solid community agreement. And I would say if this goes forward tonight, I heard a pretty clear commitment from Cole that regardless of you all signing it tonight, that there's a commitment to still have a community engagement effort ongoingly. You call it a community advisory committee or whatever the appropriate name is, but that the fact that there is no official group signing the agreement doesn't mean that there's no dialogue back and forth. And I know Cole has that commitment. I think the mayor's office is committed to ensuring that that process continue as well. So at this point, I just think that as a city we need to do a better job in addressing just the basic needs of folks in our community. I mean, we're still dealing with a community that has no curb, gutter, and sidewalk, even at this very site we're talking about, and throughout other parts of this neighborhood. And I've said to my colleagues, one of the things we should be doing is making sure that with our CIP process, where we get to set priorities and have influence and input into the administration, every neighborhood in this city should have a basic standard of living. We shouldn't still have neighborhoods without curb, gutter, sidewalk, where kids literally have to walk in the street to go to school because they don't want to walk in the mud, right? So these are some things that I think we have more work to do on. And yes, maybe Globeville and Elyria and Swansea are getting a lot of money spent in their neighborhoods, but it's on some of the infrastructure that has been needed, like the pedestrian overpass that we just had a groundbreaking for a couple weeks ago, where kids literally climb in between train cars that are stopped, unmanned train cars, because they don't want to be late to school. So these are basic priorities for these neighborhoods. So I'm going to stop at that, and I will probably vote for this, but I'm going to do it reluctantly because Evan, we have to do a better job. We cannot have another one of these brought before this body and expect this council to just fall in line when we have not, done the right job. So, and I don't mean to single you out, but you're a point guy here from the mayor's office. So anyway, thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilwoman Ortega. Seeing no other comments, I'll just end by saying thank you again for all of you for coming down here, for spending your time and your passion, for being respectful of one another in a difficult room, and in braving the weather and security. So thank you for that. I'll echo what a lot of people up here said, and that this is a very difficult position to be put in between two communities, both of whom the city has not done a good enough job for, and to have to try to come out of it with a yes or no vote is not a situation that I think anybody up here wants to be in. These are not two communities who should be pitted against each other. These are two communities that we should be, as a city, working to lift up and to support. Both of. And unfortunately, what we have here is a yes or no vote where there's a winner and there's a loser. And I wish we weren't in that situation, but that's the vote that we have in front of us. So for that, I'm sorry. And I do hope that we have a better process. And I do hope that this council really does push back on some of the things that have been said tonight about every part of the city doing their part and making sure that this conversation is citywide. So with that, I think Councilman Flynn probably said it the best, is a no vote on this means some people who are housed right now are homeless. And for me, it's a difficult decision, but I will be voting yes to make sure that those people stay housed. So, Madam